first one I'd love you to explain to us is more VUS, because I've tried to talk about it a little bit, but it at one point it starts getting pretty Byzantine, it seems, and it centers around the ability to assess taxes on profits that have yet to be realized. In other words, someone has an asset and they haven't sold it yet. That's as far as I can get it. Walk us through this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really complex case, but like the bottom line that you need to know about it is that it's a stalking horse to try to prevent very, very wealthy people from having their wealth taxed. And like the thing to understand there, so for the most part, the federal government taxes your income. You know, it taxes the new money that you make. It does not generally tax people's wealth. So if I've got $50 million sitting in a stock brokerage account somewhere, or, sitting in my art collection somewhere or something, the government generally won't tax that money. And there have been some proposals, the leading ones from Senator Elizabeth Warren, to add a wealth tax to the federal taxation system. The idea is that this is a way that we can start to get at the problem of wealth inequality. This is a way that we can make sure that a few billionaire families aren't powerful for generations to come. And so this lawsuit is an effort to essentially shut that down before it happens.
And let me just say this as by way of explanation. If I've got $50 million, let's say I keep it in a CD because I'm very conservative in that respect, but I'm getting 5% interest. The money that I make on interest there, the $2.5 million, that gets taxed.
That's correct.
Or if I have $50 million worth of stock, which I bought for $30 million, and I sell that $50 million, the $20 million gets taxed. If I sell it, but if I haven't sold it, it's considered an unrealized gain because I haven't actually sold it yet.
That's correct. Yeah. So the way the system works now is that people are generally taxed on their profits and not on the wealth itself. And so, and then the other important point that you brought up is that the taxation typically doesn't happen until you sell your investment. So, if I don't have $50 million, but let's say I have $1,000 and I put $1,000 in the stock market and then I sell it a year later for $2,000. I am taxed on the $1,000 in profit that I make. And that rule that you're generally not taxed until it's called realization. You're generally not taxed until you sell or otherwise dispose of the asset is normally a pretty good rule. It's normally a pretty good rule because it's often difficult to tell how much an asset is worth until it is sold. So you don't want a situation where someone has an asset, no one knows how much it's worth, and so no one knows how much money this person owes the government in taxes. But there are exceptions. There are actually lots of exceptions where people can be taxed on what's called unrealized income. They can be taxed on, money, assets that have gained value, but that haven't, been sold yet. And the question in this case is whether to cut that all off and basically protect people who have huge stockpiles of wealth from being taxed on the wealth itself and not on just the income that they earn.
Now, just to be clear, we're talking about the federal government's ability here, right? Because I think a lot of people are very familiar that houses and property are taxed by your local governments. And, I can maybe look on Zillow and get an idea of how much my house is worth, but I don't really know. And I may have bought the house for $250,000 and now it's worth $3.25 or something to that effect. I mean, so we do as a society, both on a local level at least, taxed unrealized gains, right? Because if your house goes up in value, even if you haven't seen that value realized, you get taxed on it. It gets reassessed. So this is a federal question?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So your local government, you'll often have property taxes. Typically state and local governments have entire infrastructures in place so they can assess the value of people's homes, so they know what the property taxes are. The federal government historically has not had property taxes. And one reason for this is that there's this bizarre provision of the Constitution that is at the heart of this Moore case. It says that direct taxes must be apportioned. And what that means is, like, if, say, Maryland has 8% of the national population, then 8% of the taxes collected, of the direct taxes collected, must come from Maryland. And
by the federal government.
By the federal government, that's correct. And that makes it next to impossible to have any kind of income tax or wealth tax, or really any kind of tax, because wealth and income is not distributed evenly amongst, the population of all 50 states. The problem with this direct tax clause, though, is literally no one knows what a direct tax is. The framers didn't know. They wrote it into the Constitution as part of a compromise over slavery, and they didn't actually all agree on what this word means. If you read the Supreme Court's decisions, the Supreme Court's decisions make it clear that they don't really know what it means, and when they tried to say what it means, they just made something up. And so essentially what the plaintiffs are arguing in this Moore case is that a tax on wealth or a tax on unrealized income violates this provision of the Constitution that no one knows what it means.
And we should also be clear that the reason why the federal government can collect an income tax is because there was an amendment to the Constitution that was passed that would theoretically supersede that, right? The 16th Amendment would supersede that clause. But this is not an income tax, and so they argue that it's not properly apportioned. Is that right?
So technically, it's a little more complicated than that. So the reason we can have an income tax, from like the founding until 1895, it was generally understood that we could have income taxes, and then in 1895, in a case called Pollock, the Supreme Court said that no, you cannot have taxes on the income generated from investments. You can't have an income tax on income generated from wages, because of course the Supreme Court back then was controlled by robber barons. But in 1895 they said you cannot have a tax on income from investments. And pretty much everyone thought that decision was wrong. The 16th Amendment was enacted in order to overrule that 1895 decision. And so the way to think of the 16th Amendment isn't that, we couldn't have income taxes and then there was this amendment and now we can. Technically the way to think about it is we could do it, then the Supreme Court said no, and then we enacted an amendment to get rid of the mistake that the Supreme Court made in the Pollock case.
All right, fair enough. And in this particular case, we're talking about monies or wealth, if you will, or value that's being taxed that is overseas. How could that apply to apportion to the states if it's money from overseas? Right. Yeah. So, I mean, if the Supreme Court were to determine that this is a direct tax, then that would be, then the plaintiffs then like the taxes have to be struck down, because it's basically impossible to do a direct tax unless you just have like what is called a head tax, where you say like everyone has to pay $75 no matter who they are, or something like that. That's the only way you can really do it in a way that's apportioned. But anyways, like the specific issue in this case deals with a tax that was part of the 2017 Trump tax bill. And what the Trump tax law did is that it used to be that we tried to tax U.S. corporations who have money that is held in an offshore subsidiary. So like they create a foreign company, they park their money in the foreign company, and we used to try to tax that money. And, the sympathetic description of what they were trying to do with the Trump tax law is that Congress decided it was too hard to tax that money. So we gave up on trying to tax foreign money that is held by U.S. corporations. And then we said, well, wait a second, like that's going to be really expensive to give up that taxing forever. So the law puts in place this one-time offset, which says that
if you are a U.S. investor in a foreign company, then you have to pay one-time tax on some of the profits that that company has earned. All of this is very complicated, but like the reason why the specific tax here matters is because it's taxing people on stock that has gained value but that has not necessarily been sold, unrealized income. And the question is whether it is unconstitutional to do that. And again, if it is unconstitutional to do that, that means that it's not just that this tax gets struck down. This tax is supposed to raise $340 billion, so it's not a small amount of money in place. It means that we can't have wealth taxes. It means that a whole bunch of other existing taxes. So if you are a member of a partnership, if the partnership makes money, the individuals are taxed on it regardless of whether they receive that money or not. That would be unconstitutional. There's entities called S corps and F corps that are taxed in a similar way. There's a long history of taxing foreign investments where like people can be taxed before they sell the asset. And if the Supreme Court strikes all of that down, we're potentially talking about trillions of dollars of money that just evaporates. All of a sudden, the federal government needs to figure out how to keep the lights on without hundreds of billions or potentially trillions of dollars in income that it was planning on. So it would be a really, really big deal if the Supreme Court were to strike down all these taxes. The good news is, based on the oral argument yesterday, there didn't seem to be much of an appetite for that.
And was there ever the irony about all of this, I should just say, and that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the case, is that the reason why we had this problem where corporations would hide their money offshore and we would beg them to repatriate it. We did it in 2004, and Bush gave them like a big discount on that taxation, ostensibly under the bill called, I think it was the American Jobs Act, if I remember correctly, which ended up not creating any jobs. In fact, like one of the biggest sort of promoters of it, I think at that time was like Hewlett Packard, and they cut like 14,000 jobs after their money was repatriated. And then what happens is these corporations hold it offshore until the next Republican who's going to come by and give them the same tax break. But the idea that you could keep the money there and not have it taxed before it was repatriated was in and of itself a tax break that Eisenhower, that happened under the Eisenhower administration as a way of building up Europe and Japan after World War II.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if Congress wanted to, at least under existing law, if Congress wanted to, it can tax U.S. companies on all of their income. So, including the income that they, potentially let me try speaking again, including the income that they make overseas. Now, that said, I mean, we've chosen not to do that. There has been, a series of forgivenesses until, this finally in 2017, Congress just said, we're going to give up on taxing this money. All of that, though, is sort of tangential to this case. The issue in this case is, does our elected representatives, I don't like what they did in 2017, but should the people who are elected to set our tax policy get to decide that, or should it be decided by 9 lawyers in black robes? And, there really isn't a principled way to distinguish the tax in this Moore case from all these other taxes that exist. There are, Justice Alito was ranting against it because Justice Alito wants the Republicans to win every case, and he wants Republican policies to be implemented. But if Justice Alito wants Republican policies to be implemented, and this is actually a Republican bill, it just includes this offset, he could run for Congress, and he can have the proper branch decide what our Congress is. Instead, this case is an attempt to shunt these important questions, who is taxed, how much are they taxed, to the one branch of government that is not elected and that currently has a Republican supermajority.
I just want to hear this clip from Sonya Sotomayor, and you tell us just sort of like how it, what she's referring to specifically in terms of like, they're being asked, according to Sotomayor, to essentially announce what put a definition of realization of profits, create one that is sort of like a one size fits all. And here's what she said.
If what we do is to think about a particular tax, which seems to be what we've been doing for over 100 years, to see whether that tax is income as understood by attribution or as an excise tax or by other principles, we wouldn't have to we would consider each tax on its own form. You're asking us to just announce what realization is out of context. And for the last 100 years, we've been studiously avoiding doing that because we recognize that it's dangerous to do that. To state a word like realization, we then have to come up with a working definition that applies to every piece of property and every way in which people gain wealth. It doesn't seem logical to me.
All right. Walk us through that. She's basically saying that you can't run a government that way because there is no one size fits all. Different contexts and different, and sort of like, I guess, innovation, financial innovation, calls for you to have like agencies deal with this.
Yeah. So, I think the background to what she's saying there is that wealthy people have really good tax lawyers. And they have really good tax lawyers who, a lot of what they do is they cull through the tax code or they cull through Supreme Court decisions defining a particular term. And then they will design, whether it is an investment, whether it's a trust, they will design some sort of system that technically does not fit in that definition. And so, one risk you have is that if the Supreme Court comes up with a one-size-fits-all definition of an important tax concept like realization, then tax lawyers will come up with some sort of vehicle that just doesn't fit into that definition, but still allows investors to earn the same amount of money that they would earn otherwise. And so you just wind up having all of this untaxed income. The other problem is that it skews the investment markets. So, let's say the Supreme Court comes up with a definition of what is realization, and that definition excludes, money that is earned in the state of Idaho. What's going to happen if the Supreme Court comes up with that definition is that everyone's just going to move their money to Idaho, and corporations are going to relocate their headquarters in Idaho, and everyone's going to try to get some sort of connection to Idaho and their investments because that way they can avoid taxes. And that's, not how we want a market economy to work. We don't want people to make investment choices based on what's going to help them avoid taxes. We want people to make investment choices based on what they think is most likely to, be a good investment. Right.
All right. Well, and so I guess we'll find out how they rule in June or July on that one, but as far as you could tell from the questioning, it doesn't look like it's going to be as problematic as it could have been.
I think that's right. I mean, they might write a very narrow opinion that sort of leaves open the question of what happens if Elizabeth Warren gets the majority she needs to pass her wealth tax.
Right.
But I think they realize that regardless of what they think about some hypothetical future tax that probably will never get passed anyway, they shouldn't hand down a decision that nukes so much of the current tax code that the federal government can't keep the lights on anymore.